Representative Jim Dunnigan from District 39, a Republican of the Utah House of Representatives. Thank you so much for being part of 3 Questions today.
Thanks for inviting me here.
The 4th of July and Pioneer Day have come to represent a lot of fireworks activity. And here we are living in the Mountain West, in the mountain deserts. How do you balance, as a legislator, how do you balance the desire of people to light these fireworks in celebration and still deal with the risk of lighting a lot of dry vegetation on fire and causing a lot of property damage?
Well, that's actually a great question, and it's challenging to find that balance. We go back to John Adams' comment when the nation was founded, and he said this date, meaning July 4th, should be celebrated every year throughout the nation with bonfires and illuminations, which are fireworks. And so many people love to celebrate the founding of our country on July 4th. And it just so happens that our pioneers didn't come here in January when we wouldn't have to worry about fires. They came in July, so we have 2 holidays in the same month. And there are people that love to celebrate the founding of our country and the founding of our state, and then there are other people that say we'd rather have a little more peace and quiet.
Is it possible to legislate common sense when it comes to fireworks?
Well, you know, I was told from the very beginning when I started in the legislature that you can't legislate against stupidity. And so that's going to happen. And frankly, if people would just obey our current laws, our current fireworks law, we'd be in a much better place than where we are today.
A bill that you authored in 2011 lifted the 15-foot limit for aerial fireworks. Since that time, there has been a number of fireworks-related fires. Is it fair to connect one with the other?
It may be, but I got this information from the state fire marshal, some interest to me. In 2010, before we changed the fireworks law, there were 10 fireworks-caused fires that year. In 2016, there were 10 fireworks-caused fires in our state. Now this year we may have more. We'll know in September when the fire year ends. But I've gotten the confirmed firework-caused fires going back since we changed the law, and it's, you know, about that. I think in 2014 it was a couple of dozen. So it may be more fires, but the fireworks-caused fires in the last few weeks. The one in Cottonwood Heights, that was the fireworks were discharged in an area where fireworks had already been banned. Right. The one in St. George, they did that outside the time period. So those were illegal anyway.
Mm. In 2011, the Utah legislature passed a bill that you had authored that increased the 15-foot height limit for aerial fireworks. How did that bill come to be, and why did you introduce it?
I had a number of constituents that came to me and they said, how come we can't do a firework that goes higher than 15 feet without going to Wyoming and bringing back stuff that is definitely higher than that, but doesn't conform with the law? And how come it can't travel more than 10 feet on the ground? And I thought those were good questions. And so I went to the state fire marshal and I said, where's the science behind nothing going higher than 15 feet? And he said there is no science behind it. It was just a negotiated piece of legislation, and I think it was the mid or late 90s, and it's just stayed on the books since. And I said, well, I have constituents that are saying, why can't we do, is there a little bit more? And so I asked him, I said, is there anything else that we could do in Utah that would still keep things safe, but maybe disincentivize people to go to Wyoming and bring back the bigger stuff and the stuff that seems to cause fires, like bottle rockets at the time were causing a lot of fires. And he said, I don't know, but let me get back to you. So a few weeks later he came back and he said, I think I found a firework that might fit what we're talking about, and that's called aerials. They're designed to shoot up, they shoot up higher, but they're designed so that when they come down, they're not hot or they're not on fire. Now, I know there are some exceptions, but generally, that's how they're designed. And he said, I think that's something that could work.
Hmm. And so, how did it go from the fire marshal coming back with that to you introducing this bill?
Okay, so I had meetings with representatives from the counties, the cities, the state forester, the state fire marshal, the fire prevention board, and we talked about this. And at that time there was a real mishmash of fireworks laws throughout the state. In certain areas of the state it was up to the sheriff to determine when fireworks were allowed and what type. And other areas a police chief. Some places it was a fire chief. Some places it was a water master. Because they said, well, in charge of fireworks. Oh. Well, you know, water, you need water to throw on fire. And so I said, so the water master was in charge. And so we thought, let's come up with some standardized uniform plan and the statute. And so they had their annual fires conference down in southern Utah. They got all the fire officials from around this state, and they discharged these aerials. And as soon as the debris would hit the ground, the fire officials and the fire chiefs would run over and grab it to see how hot it was. And in their surprise, it was not flaming, and it wasn't that hot. So we worked very collaboratively with many organizations, including the fireworks manufacturers, and we came up with the 2011 legislation.
Over the 4th of July holiday, Salt Lake County dispatchers say that they sent out 70 or received 70 fireworks-related calls. Now, you're introducing legislation in the upcoming session that kind of walks back from where the 2011 restrictions were. Are those two related at all?
Well, this year has been a very hot year and a very dry year. In fact, they said July is the hottest on record now. So it's somewhat unusual. I will say that 2 weeks ago I met with the state fire marshal and the state forester and other fire officials, and we talked about the calls in Salt Lake, including the Salt Lake City fire chief was there. One thing to keep in mind that they get 70 calls, but many of those calls are for the same incident. And that happens on virtually all emergency, or many emergency calls anyway. Multiple people will call for the same incident. That said, I'm sure there were many incidents that night. So I've heard from a lot of people that, can we take a look at our fireworks law? I've also heard from a lot of people that say, no, we love the way it is, don't touch it, you know. But I've already started having meetings. I'm going to do just what I did several years ago, collaborate with the various stakeholders and see what, if any, changes should be made.
At this point, and I realize it's still early in the game, we're still months away from the session, do you have some kind of idea as to what kind of restrictions you might introduce to any new legislation you'd bring to the fore?
Well, there's one thing that we're going to do, and I have draft legislation that's almost done, and that's to kind of clean up the current law. There's some ambiguity in the current law. And as we do that, I intend to give the local government a little more authority on where they can ban fireworks. Beyond that, I don't really want to say what's going to happen because I'm still in the process of meeting with many stakeholders, and I've not met with some, and I don't want them to feel like things are predetermined.
After the 4th of July and all of the fireworks-related calls that dispatchers received, for the 24th of July, it seemed like people kind of got the message, and there were nowhere near as many fireworks-related calls. Of course, it was raining pretty hard that night, too. But still, restrictions that are in place are hard to enforce because the very people who would be enforcing them should be out fighting the fires. How do you effectively enforce restrictions?
And that's one of the big challenges, but frankly it's one of the things that we need to do a better job of. And we have tremendous demands on the police and fire, we really do. But there doesn't appear to be a lot of enforcement now. Even when people are discharging outside the windows, they're just not, and if we could get some enforcement on that, I think that would help. People need to know that there's a consequence. If you're discharging at 2 and 3 in the morning, which is ridiculous, there needs to be some enforcement. And those are easy to do. There's not that many people doing it at 2 or 3 in the morning.
No, that's true. Would this be something that the legislature would look at, increased funding for law enforcement and fire departments to be able to go out and have more staff to go out and enforce the restriction?
Well, I would love to provide funding, but if I want to provide funding, then I have to come up with a source of money to provide that funding, and that will weigh the bill down. That will bog it down, because it's one thing for a policy to pass and a change in the statute. It's another thing if it's going to require dollars. And I've had some people say, well, take a, you know, put a tax on fireworks or a fee or something like that. And I expect we'll consider a variety of those issues.
At this point, who is buying in on the adjustments that you're making to the legislation? Who do you have in your corner now?
That want to make adjustments?
Yeah.
Well, many of the local governments, the cities, the towns, the counties, they want to weigh in, and they weighed in before several years ago. The fire service does. You know what? One thing that was interesting to me when I had the meeting with the fire chief from Salt Lake City, and we were talking about aerials, and he said of a bigger concern to him are these ground bloom flowers, where you light them and they're a pretty color, but they jump all over the place, and they can jump the curb, and he said that those actually cause their city more problems than the aerials. And so another thing I've learned about fireworks is people like them, they don't, and there's a full range in between if they like certain ones or they don't. You know, years ago, before we passed legislation, skyrockets and bottle rockets were a big hazard for starting fires because they just shoot anywhere.
Yeah, they go all over the place. Do you find it ironic that we're putting restrictions on one of the most basic forms of expression of appreciation for the freedom that we enjoy in this country?
There's a great irony there, isn't there? We're celebrating our nation's independence, and we're going to do that by telling you that you can't celebrate the way that you want.
There are some people who are talking about banning aerial fireworks in Utah altogether. Mm-hmm. Do you think it will get to that?
It's a possibility. I would be surprised, just because I said, depending who you talk to, some fire officials think there's a greater hazard in other things. You know, sparklers are a hazard too. They can certainly start fires and they cause burns. And so I know I've seen proposed legislative ideas from banning all personal fireworks, and that you have to go to professional show, to banning aerials, to cutting down the number of days. And I intend to look at all those. We've had some discussion on it. But it's a challenge. Let's say a city, and we had some cities over the 24th that banned aerials. But it's hard to prevent sound from one city going to a bordering city next door. So even though you have a law that aerials can't be discharged in one city, the neighboring city, it's still going to discharge, and you'll hear the sounds from that.
So how do you bring a uniformity then? I mean, is it the state government's job then to bring a uniformity that all of the communities, all of the counties and cities and towns have to follow? Or can you leave them some leeway so that they can, if they're in a different part of the state, they can ban them if they want?
Well, one of the things that generated the piece of legislation several years ago is that the state forester was largely in charge of much of the state, and they could say it's banned here or here or here. And yet for the state forester to do a statewide ban in central or rural Utah, where maybe they have open fields and things like that, versus metropolitan Utah, it was just totally different worlds. And so in the current law, we do give the local government a fair amount of discretion. So to answer your question, I think the state is well suited, as we do in much of state law, to provide the basic parameters and then give some latitude to the local governments.
There are fireworks for sale in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and elsewhere in that state that are illegal here. Have you ever sensed a willingness on the part of Wyoming lawmakers to maybe limit the kinds of fireworks that they sell to Utah residents?
No, actually, exactly the opposite. When I worked on this legislation several years ago, the Wyoming fireworks manufacturers and sellers hired lobbyists to come and work against the bill, because they were afraid that if we allowed an additional type of fireworks here in Utah, it would diminish their sales in Wyoming. So they fought against the bill. So no, I don't see them restricting sales to Utahns.
Not in a sense of being a good neighbor and keeping us from lighting ourselves on fire.
No, I think they will take our dollars, which generates tax revenue for them and sales, and then leave what happens up to us. Mm.
As the nation waits for health care reform to finally come about, if it ever does come about, can you give Utahns any hope that what they have on Obamacare will not be lost in whatever the GOP comes up with down the line, if they ever come up with anything?
It's really hard to predict what will happen in Washington, but I think there's a desire among the U.S. House and Senate and the President to maintain coverage, or subsidized coverage, or tax-helped coverage for the Utahns that have it now, and I think that the plan is that that would continue. Certainly nothing's changed, and so things are just marching on as they are. But even under the proposals, there would be subsidized coverage for particularly for the little bit lower income and the lower income Utahns. I think there's a desire to do that, and I think that's likely to stay in some form.
Can Utah do anything, can you in the legislature do anything that would enhance any kind of a plan that comes from Washington?
You know, there are some things that we've talked about, and developing a high-risk pool again and trying to help people that are high risk, put them in there, but have taxpayer subsidized premiums so their rates are competitive, but then and manage them, help them be healthier. We are hoping for some flexibility from the new administration. So largely what we can do is up to the federal government, unfortunately. I wish they'd give our state more flexibility. We are in conversation right now of what can we do, what could we do to lower prices, which is really what we need, lower costs, and then make it more available to Utahns.
There are a number of Utahns who are really worried that they're going to be left totally exposed in their health care coverage. What kind of hope can you give them?
Well, for the states that expanded Medicaid, the federal legislation that's being considered is going to ratchet down the amount of the cost that the federal government contributes. Utah did not expand Medicaid for the enhanced match, so we don't have that worry. Many states that expanded Medicaid, they're having cost overruns. This is the first year that the states have to start paying a share in Medicaid expansion, and some of the states are wondering how they're going to afford that. We did pass Medicaid expansion for a smaller subset a year ago, but that was done at our traditional federal match, and so I don't believe that's in jeopardy. And in fact, July 1, 2,300 adults got full Medicaid coverage that had not been eligible before from the legislation that we passed a year ago. And we still have a bigger piece that will cover 6,000 or 7,000 of the chronically homeless and other low-income adults that we hope will be approved in time for enrollment January 1st of 18.
There are 3 initiatives headed to the ballot in 2018: medical marijuana, the political boundaries, and our schools now, education funding. And we may hear from Count My Vote again, because they're talking about maybe becoming active again. What kind of a message does that send to the legislature in regard to those issues, medical marijuana, education funding, political boundaries, and that kind of thing? Well,
regarding medical marijuana, a year ago, not this last session, but a year ago, we had 2 competing bills. One started in the Senate, one in the House. The one bill passed the Senate, came to the House, it went through negotiations, and it was a compromise. It wasn't as far as those that wanted medical marijuana wanted to go, and it wasn't as little as those that didn't want to do anything, but it would have expanded the availability of medical marijuana. But then the proponents of the medical marijuana came to us and said, we don't want the bill to advance, we don't want the compromise to advance, because then we think that Utahns won't want to go even further, and we want to go further. But we were ready to go. But at their request, we didn't consider the legislation in the House, and now it's going on the initiative. And so to answer your question, these initiatives, I think they do send a message to the legislature that these are important to Utahns. One of the big challenges with initiatives is you cannot get into the nuances of the ramifications when you go and you just sign and say, I want this, and then it can't be changed. Whatever you sign, that's the initiative, that's the law, that's what it's going to take place. That's one of the big problems we've found with SB 54, where you can get on the ballot through signatures. It needs some changes to it, but once it goes on and it becomes law, it's the same verbiage that it was on the initiative.
Is the legislature able to make any adjustments to any initiatives after they either pass or, well, if they pass?
Yes, and that's a great point. So if an initiative passes, it becomes law. And just like any existing law, the legislature may change it, may update it. But you always run the jeopardy of, well, if you change that, you're going against the will of the people because they passed it in that form. And so, but we change current law. That's largely what we do every legislative session.
for those folks who are depending on medical marijuana to take care of seizure issues or chronic pain or nausea issues from chemotherapy and that kind of thing. And it seems to be a growing number of people who are discovering that medical marijuana is helpful to them. Can you give them any hope that if the initiative passes, the legislature isn't going to roll it back in some form?
Well, when you say in some form, that's hard to predict. I think the broad initiative would stay. I think that we would then look at what's the best way to implement that and it's safety and effective. One of the challenges that you have with medical marijuana, and I have family members that would love to use that and hope that they could benefit from it, even though it's still illegal under federal law. So you have all these...
Yeah, I do too, and I know a number of folks.
I really do, and I would like to get to the point where you know that it is effective and a consistent dosage. One of the challenges now is how do you get a consistent dosage, you know, in medical marijuana? That's a real challenge. We funded the University of Utah this past legislative session to look at it and see what the dosages are, what the effectiveness is, and so that's underway right now.
All right. Well, Jim Dunnigan, District 39 Republican from the Utah House of Representatives, thank you for being part of 3 Questions.
Thanks, Bob.